All right, today for anatomy and physiology, we will talk about bone structure and function. The outline of today's lecture goes as follows. We will talk about the shapes of the bones, the various components of a long bone. I will also show you a primer on the human skeleton. We will talk about the two parts of the skeleton, the axial and appendicular skeleton, and we will finish off this lecture by talking about the pectoral and pelvic girdles. Now we're going to start talking about bones based on their shape. So we're going to talk about the classification of bones based on their shape. So let's start with the flat bone. So the flat bones like this are the bones that are found in your skull, such as the parietal bone, but also the frontal bone, the occipital bone, to name a few examples. Then let's talk about long bones. So you have your long bone. Your prototypical long bone is a humerus, and the long bone is called long because, hell, it's a long bone. Just look at the shape of this bone. Your radius and ulna are also examples of long bones. Your femur, your fibula, your tibia as well. Your short bones are of course short, and the carpal bones in your hands are an example. A sesamoid bone is a bone that's found within a ligament or within a tendon, and classic example is the patella. And last but not least, irregular bones are basically bones that don't fit into any of the other categories, and they're irregularly shaped. Now let's talk about the components of a long bone. So there are two types of bone. You have your cortical bone and your spongy bone. Your cortical or your compact bone is the bone that's on the outer portion. That's the solid part of the bone. Your spongy bone is, of course, the spongy portion. And looking at it here, it tends to be located in the epiphyseal area of the bone. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. The epiphyses are the ends of the bone. The epiphyseal line, or otherwise known as epiphyseal plates, are located here. And in children, they serve as the growth centers of the bone. So when children are growing, these growth centers allow the bones to elongate as the children grow taller. You also have your bone marrow, which is located in the medullary cavity. So this is your medullary cavity, and this is your yellow bone marrow. There's also red marrow, and your bone marrow is also a source of production of the cellular elements of the blood. So basically what I'm saying is that your red blood cells, white blood cells, even platelets are made in the bone marrow. Your periosteum is the outer covering of the bone. Peri means around, osteum is bone, so it's a covering around the bone. And then you have your articular surface, which is covered with articular cartilage, and that's where that's the surface where two bones meet to form a joint. So, for example, for in your elbow, for example, you have two bones meeting, and their joint surfaces are covered by the articular cartilage. Now let's look at an overview of the human skeleton. The human skeleton contains 206 bones in an adult. Most of these bones are named in a systematic fashion, which makes it easier to remember the names of the bones and even the function of these bones. This diagram here can serve as a primer to learn the bones of the human body. And we're going to learn more about these bones in later lectures. And we will learn about these bones in a systematic way that makes it easy for you to remember these bones. The human skeleton is divided into the axial and appendicular skeleton. And these two pictures here are nice and color coded so that you can remember what's what. So your axial skeleton, it runs along the axis of the body, and it consists of your skull, your ribs, your sternum, and the vertebral column. The appendicular skeleton is the bony elements of the limbs. So it consists of bones that form the upper limb. They consist of the pectoral girdle. It consists of bones that form the lower limb, and it consists of the pelvic girdle. Now let's talk about the pectoral girdle, which, as we have already mentioned, is part of the appendicular skeleton. And the pectoral girdle consists of the clavicle and the scapula, as labeled nicely here. And it's also color-coded in yellow, so that you can easily visualize it and remember it. The pelvic girdle, aka the pelvis, is also part of the appendicular skeleton. It's also known as the os coxae. However, it seems to be only known as the os coxae in anatomy books and not so much in the real world, because I hadn't even heard of this term before until I started teaching anatomy myself. And the pelvic girdle consists of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, as you can see labeled here. It looks like we're done. I'll be back. Okay, that was bad. But anyway, like this video, subscribe. And it is true, I will be back because we have more to talk about. We have the rest of the skeleton to talk about, as well as muscles and all sorts of neat structures in the human body.